morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, part 2 of a series on chemical application and plant health. I'm Kate Spurgeon, editor of Greenhouse Management Magazine. Today, we're going to be discussing techniques and tips for better sprays. Just a few housekeeping things before we get started. Throughout the webinar, if you have any questions, please enter them in the question box on the right-hand side of your screen, and we'll address them at the Q&A at the end of the webinar. In a few days, we'll also be sending all registrants a link to a recording of the webinar in case you'd like to share this with your colleagues or go over any of the material on your own. So let's welcome Kurt Becker, Executive Vice President of Commercial Products, Sales, and Marketing for Dramm Corporation. Thanks for being here today, Kurt.
Thank you very much, Kate. I appreciate the introduction. As Kate said, I'm with Dramm. I've been here for 25 years, and in that capacity, I spent a lot of time with growers on pest management. Dramm as a company, we've been around for 75, or actually almost 80 years now, since our anniversary was a few years ago. And over the years, everybody's very familiar with the water breaker, obviously, but we've moved into pest management fairly heavily, making a number of different pieces of equipment for growers to use. As part of that, we decided we wanted to do a webinar series to really talk about the different types of equipment. Today, we're going to spend a little bit more time on the techniques and tips to do a better job. And then next November, we're actually going to do a talk more on using some of those tools for cleaning, cleaning your greenhouse, disinfecting and cleaning. Now, as you see here, I've got Jared Babick slated, was supposed to be doing this talk. Unfortunately, he ended up otherwise disposed today. So I'm picking up his talk today. So you get me twice if you're going to pay attention, if you're going to go through our whole series. Of course, the one that Louis Dam did a couple months ago that really talked more about all the different types of equipment a little bit more in depth, and the differences between them primarily. That's something that you can watch online. If you missed it, you've got the ability to see that either on our website or on the GIU website. They've got that as well. So feel free to check that out if this webinar sparks any questions for you. So we're going to talk today about better applications, and that we're going to really go through several different points in that. First is going to be choosing the right equipment. There's a lot of different machines. As I told you, Dramm ourselves, we make 38, 39 different types. And then when I had one of our operations people correct me the other day that, yes, we make 38 to 39 different types of machines, but when we actually count all of the options, changes, modifications we make to those, it's well over 150. And that's things like hose length, wheel type, even on the same machine. Just our hydraulic sprayer line, we make 80 different versions of it, and it's because you have so many different ways to customize those for each facility, for each type of application, and all those things are important as you're choosing a piece of equipment. So we'll talk a little bit about that. We're going to talk about training to do a better job. How do you know? Being able to gauge your applications is a big part of that. Understanding how you're spraying and how effectively you're spraying is a part of that. So we'll talk about that. We're going to talk about some techniques that you may want to try to employ, some different things that are somewhat tried and true. There's a lot of people with spraying experience, and I think that probably the biggest benefit people get out of our talks is maybe just looking at it from a different perspective sometimes. You've been spraying for 20 years, you probably are really good at it. But sometimes we like to think, just take a different view of how to do something, and maybe hopefully something we say will spur something that might improve the timing of your application, the efficacy of your application, just because we're going to look at different ways that you might do it. And then finally, we're going to talk a little bit about some specialty applications that don't necessarily fall into the spraying category, but they fall into the pest management and chemical application category. Things like drenching and foaming, which are both important things we need to be considering when we're trying to basically, the entire point of this webinar is about the equipment and how to do a better job, but really the overall approach is to try and do a better job at managing pests. And so if we can find a way to break the life cycle by doing something differently, spraying a different method with a different piece of equipment or with a different technique. All of that's aimed at doing a better job of controlling pests in our greenhouse and ultimately having a better crop for our customer and a more saleable crop and having less shrink at the end of the day for better profitability. So when we talk about the different types of equipment, some of this is going to be a little bit repetitive if you've watched the first webinar. I just want to go back and touch really on particle size. Particle size is one of the ways we gauge different types of equipment. And that's because we're trying with all those different machines, we're aiming the ability of that machine. We're trying to find different ways to create different size droplets because different size droplets do different things in the greenhouse. So the symbol I have up on the screen is symbol for micron, which is a unit of measure. It is a measurement of length, like an inch or a yard. It's just a really small one. Your hair is about 100 microns in diameter. So when we talk about particle size, that's the unit of measure we use, and that image in your head of now hair, that's actually a good dividing line, 100 microns. Things that are bigger than that, things that are smaller than that, kind of put them in different categories. So understanding particle science and volume as it applies to volume of spray application is also an important thing to consider when we're talking about different types of machines. So on the screen now I have 3 different droplet sizes. Let's say that the one on the left, the big one, is 100 microns in diameter. So it's magnified quite a bit. But think about that as the size of your hair. If I take the liquid that is contained in that single 100 micron droplet, so I've got one of those, and I cut that into droplets that are half the size, okay, or in this case, 50 microns. Because this is volumatic, it's 3-dimensional, I actually have 8 droplets with the same amount of liquid. What that means is I've got, especially because the primary carrier we use in applying pesticides in the greenhouse is water, and water tends to have a very strong surface tension, which means it likes to bead up and combine and stick together without any other chemical means. You're going to have 8 droplets, but that 8 droplets, because you've chopped them up, are actually going to cover more surface area than the single 100 micron droplet would. If we take that 100 micron droplet and we break it down to 1/10 of the original size, in this case that would be 10 microns, you're going to get about 1,000 droplets with the same amount of liquid. So again, we can cover more surface area with that. If I go off this chart and we made droplets that were 1/20 of the original size, or in this case 5 microns, we end up with about 19,000 droplets with the same amount of liquid in the 100 micron droplet, or the size of your hair. What this is trying to illustrate is mechanically we can break the droplets down into smaller bits so that they can cover much more surface area. This is kind of the basis for low volume application, but it's also really important for you to be considering when you are thinking about hydraulic application. So I can recalibrate this whole thing, and instead of 100 microns on the left, I can make 1,000 microns on the left. That is not atypical for some types of hydraulic spray equipment that's in the market. We use low pressure, we use a very coarse spray. I've even seen people going out using their injector and regular, line pressure and a faucet nozzle to do some pesticide applications. You're getting 1,000 microns or larger when that's the case. You're getting a big droplet. So if you imagine that just through moving down this spectrum slightly, so let's say instead of that 1,000 micron droplet, I'm actually creating 500 micron droplets, which are still pretty big in the spray world. I'm able to cover much more surface area because I'm creating 8 times more droplets with this volume of liquid in my spray tank. So I'm going to create a finer droplet that's going to cover more surface area. Like I said, 8 times more droplets just by cutting that droplet in half. If I get it down to 100 microns, which is achievable at a hydraulic spray in a hydraulic spray application, just by typically increasing pressure, maybe decreasing volume a little bit, making it a less wet spray. Instead of 2 gallons a minute, you're applying half a gallon a minute. I can have 1,000 times more droplets created with the same liquid in my tank. Say I have a 50-gallon tank and I just simply adjust the pressure and the flow, changing the nozzle out, increasing the pressure regulator. I can do a lot better job because I can cover more surface area. Now, the other thing that's really nice as you get to these smaller droplets is they tend to not run off as much. Because they're not these big droplets that have combined and have a lot more mass, they tend to be less bound by gravity and tend to actually adhere better to plant surfaces. So a lot of the times that can actually help you do a better job and be less wasteful because you're not running it off the plant. You can coat the plant more quickly and more evenly with smaller droplets without as much of the waste. So hopefully, maybe a number of you guys watched the previous webinar. I'm not going to go into the particle size anymore, other than as I talk about the different types of equipment. So in the world, we look at hydraulic sprayers, we look at targeted low volume application, and we look at ultra low volume. And we break the world down basically in those ways because it really changes the technique and the way that you're going to use these machines. But it's all about that particle size. Those machines on the left, you're creating droplets that are bigger than 100 microns typically. Those ones in the middle, those targeted machines, these are low volume machines, so they're less than 100 microns, where you're able to use less liquid typically to make them do a good job because we're creating so many more droplets. But they're aimed. I aim these at what I'm spraying at. And then on the right, we've got ultra low volume equipment, which use even smaller droplets. And the idea behind them is that they are going to fill the space. These are space treatment options. We're filling a room. You cannot spray a bench with this type of equipment. It's a fog, but it tends to radically change the way you're going to make the application. Quite often that means a great reduction in the amount of time it requires, but it also means that it's going to, you're going to fill a whole space fairly effectively without a lot of waste because we don't run it off. So looking at the different types of equipment, hydraulic sprays, generally, as we are used to, this is fairly common. This is a wet spray. Things are going to get wet. Looking at just the backpack sprayer, this thing creates about 150 psi, so it generally sprays about, with the nozzle in it, which is a half gallon a minute, we get about a 200 micron droplet with this, 2 to 250. At the finest pressure, we can get closer to that 200 micron range, which gives you a lot of capacity to basically cover surface area. When you think about the way hydraulic sprays are done, you need to aim them at the plants. You need to go basically through each plant. Now, it's obviously different with, say, a backpack sprayer than a hydraulic sprayer. A hydraulic sprayer with a hose that and a gun, and you've got a lot of pressure and a lot of force behind that, more volume behind that. A backpack sprayer, when you think about a pump-up sprayer, you're getting 30 to 40 psi. You're probably getting a 300 to 400 micron droplet, and you're not getting a lot of propulsion. So what you do with that type of sprayer is you tend to spray plant to plant. You're going over that plant, you're going under that plant, you're moving the wand a lot to try and target better into the canopy, trying to do a better job of coating that plant. When we go up a little bit to a higher pressure backpack sprayer, so the one I just showed you was battery powered and gets 150 psi, now we have more pressure, which equates to more force of the spray. We're also tending to get a finer droplet as a result, and so that force isn't anything that's going to damage the plant. It's going to help propel those droplets, which means that when we move up to that type of a sprayer, a little bit more power behind it, we are able to spray at a little bit greater distance. I don't have to go plant to plant. I can kind of spray a couple plants at a time. When we move to a standard hydraulic sprayer, so the one we had in the picture, that's creating about a 500 psi spray with a lot more volume, so that we get a lot of force. I can spray 15, 18 feet away, depending on the type of crop, obviously. The more foliage, the more density, your distance tends to decrease a little bit just because you want more force as you hit that canopy. But what that ends up doing is it allows you to do a little bit better job more quickly because you're not having to go to each plant individually and spray it. That tends to end up looking something like this. You're going to be in a greenhouse, and whether you're going to spray up one side of the row and spray back one side of the row, or you spray across the entire area, something like that, where you'd spray an entire bay, spraying back and forth, you're going to have to move through that entire greenhouse, going up and down throughout each aisle before you get to the end, and you're done spraying over here. Now that gives you that if you're doing the whole greenhouse, that takes some time, but quite often you don't need to do the whole greenhouse. Sometimes, and one of the biggest advantages of a targeted type application like a hydraulic sprayer is that you don't have to spray the whole greenhouse. You're going to be spraying corners where you've noticed problems. You're going to be spraying benches of specific crops. It's going to give you the ability to do that selectively, and not have to treat the entire place. So one of the things, though, that we like to help people with on the hydraulic range, we see a lot of people spraying. We work a lot with people coaching on both watering and spraying. And here's a place where you have a similar technique challenge. Quite often, we'll see growers spraying like this guy. Now, what you're seeing him do is spraying linearly straight across the bench. And if you look at the way he's spraying a crop that is right next to him, probably 1.5 feet away from the nozzle. And he's spraying the crop across the whole bed, and that crop is probably 8 feet away from the tip of the nozzle. So understanding that we're using a conical spray nozzle, what ends up happening is something more like this. He's spraying real close, and all of the spray solution from that gun is hitting a much smaller area of the crop than it is when he sprays the other side of the bed. And so he's doing really two different applications. He's doing a very wet spray that's downward at the crop right next to him. One of the things we like people to consider is the physiology of the plant. A plant is really created by nature to be like an umbrella. It sheds water off of the outside of the canopy to the outside of the root zone, helping to push the roots out. So if you spray down and you have a bunch of whitefly that have laid their eggs up nice and tight underneath those leaves, you're not hitting them. You're spraying the top of that umbrella, and they're all safe and happy and nice and dry underneath. So you need typically to get an angle of attack that's coming in from the side of the plant, and that's going to change based on the plant. That's going to change based on the maturity of that plant. It's going to change based on if you're growing on the ground or if you're growing on a bench, if you're growing a vine crop. All of that is going to change your angle of attack to be able to get into the canopy. But I think we would all agree that spraying down on the top of the canopy is probably not the best way to get inside of the canopy, to get to the stem, to get to the undersides of the leaves. So one of the things that we generally like to recommend is that instead of spraying across the bench linearly, you spray in an arc. And so let's move to the next slide. Here, you've got a basic video showing how a spray pattern works. You have the propulsion part of the spray, and you have the diffusion part of the spray. Propulsion component is basically going to be made up of a single direction of force. It's all blowing straight out. It's concentrated. It's not what you want to hit the plant with. The diffusion part is where we start getting swirling. Basically, the droplets are hitting friction, air friction. You start getting a lot of swirling to the spray. We like to suggest that you don't spray with the propulsion part, you spray with the diffusion part. Number one, that's going to help you get a distance to the crop that's going to get the spray pushed into the canopy as opposed to on top of the canopy. And then you want to keep that same distance as you spray, so you're always using that swirling part of the spray to help lift the leaves and get into the canopy. And then use an arc. So you're always, say if I got 15 feet, like this is a 30-foot wide greenhouse we're showing right now, I want to spray across that distance, and I want to be able to hit the same distance throughout. So instead of spraying linear across the bench where I spray 2 feet, a 2-foot wide pattern, and then across and the other side I'm spraying an 8-foot wide pattern, I am keeping the same distance, covering the same amount of surface area of plant, the same area of plant area, and I'm pushing into the canopy from the side. This is going to help us lift the leaves. You know, we would much rather see dancing leaves. So you hit it from the side, the leaves all lift up and dance around in the air. You hit them from the top and they lay down and they're all wilty. We don't want to see wilty, we want to see lifting. So that arc technique is going to give you the same distance to crop all the time. And if you look at the video that we showed, that's going to play in as we talk about training. Remember that when we get to that point of the talk. So along that same line, we have targeted low volume, which is again going to be an aimed spray. So a lot of times you're going to want that same technique where you're going to go in from the side, you're going to move in an arc, you're not going to spray the things close to you and then spray things far away from you. The plants next to you, you want to spray after you've taken 3 steps back. You want to be hitting the plants that are 3-4 steps in front of you when you're spraying the aisle. So as I said before, targeted low volume is still like a hydraulic spray in that we're aiming it. I am going to aim it at the crop, but I'm doing it a little bit differently. In this instance, I'm using either really, really high pressure or I'm using air atomization to create a droplet that's generally, 50 microns, 80 microns. So smaller than your hair. That allows us to get more surface area covered with less liquid. And so that allows us typically to use less liquid when we do these applications. The term low volume refers to the amount of liquid that we actually use to make the application. So when we look at the way something like this is going to work, you're still aiming the spray, but you see that's got a little 5-liter tank on there. That's a really dry spray. You see we're arcing again, we're trying to get through the canopy, but nothing's wet. So here there's no wetting of the leaves with this type of system. And that's probably the biggest challenge when we try and train people on targeted equipment, is that they may be used to the hydraulic sprayer going and getting things wet. Getting things wet with a targeted low volume sprayer is not a good idea, because typically we're concentrating the solution more. We want to use a similar amount of active ingredient per square foot. We're just going to use less water to deliver it. So getting things wet means you're overspraying. You're putting too much on. We generally tend not to think that's a good idea. Typically, you can see more damage that way, but more than anything, you're just going to waste more product. So with this type of machine, that technique that I showed about arcing, the difference is going to be you're not going to see things wet as an indicator that you've gotten that plant. You need to move at a pace where you trust that small droplet is getting there, because really, quite frankly, it's hard to see that droplet. You'll see some speckling on the plant, you'll see it glistening a bit, but you're not going to see it wet and running off. Now, like the hydraulic spray, this is the same deal. You got to go in and you got to go spray. Now, because we're putting it through with a lot less liquid, we can generally do these applications faster. They generally are going to cover more square footage per minute with these types of machines. So that's again another place where training and technique and playing with the machine and understanding it and getting comfortable with it is important so that you do a good job with it. It's about moving through the crop quickly. Now, if we look at a targeted low volume, that was just a faster application of before. But one of the places where it's really important to consider, low volume is going to give you some benefits in that you're going to use less liquid, you're going to be making the crop less wet. So really a good idea if you're thinking about fungicides. We can apply a lot of fungicides through targeted and ultra low volume methods, which then doesn't put the same volume of water onto the crop. Now, the water is the delivery method for those fungicides typically, and when you first apply them, they are going to be great at helping to eradicate the pest or the problem. But that's typically 100 gallons an acre of water that you're adding to a crop or to a problem which is typically moisture related. So low volume, using less liquid to do that, is actually a good way to help prevent adding too much moisture to that situation. Another thing that you want to think about from the targeted low volume standpoint that makes it very useful is I can do that, but I can spray tomatoes and I can spray impatiens differently. The hydraulic sprayer is going to give you this advantage. The targeted low volume is going to give you this advantage. The reason you need to think about that is the tomato has a different range of pesticides that are usable than the impatient. And plenty of guys have both of these things in the same greenhouse. So if I'm going to fog the greenhouse, I'm going to have to use a pesticide that's usable on the tomatoes and may not be all that effective on the impatient. So something like a targeted machine is going to allow us to spray the impatiens with one product and spray the tomatoes or the other edibles with another product. Something that needs to be really considered as you are making that choice. Now, when we talk about training, this type of tool that we're going to discuss is really only usable for these targeted applications. There's some products that you can get in the market, whether they're ultraviolet dyes or they are hydrosensitive paper, where you can take this product and when it gets wet, it turns blue. It's a really good tool to see where you spray. Now, I might be dating myself, but when I was a kid in school, we were in second or third grade, the dentist would come to our class and they would talk about proper dental hygiene. And one of the things that they would do is give us these silly little red tablets. And they would tell you to go home and brush your teeth and chew these tablets. And supposedly it was going to stick to where where you didn't do a good job brushing, so you could see where you missed. This is the same thing. It's showing you not only where you hit, but where you missed. And the way you would use this stuff typically, the stuff it's not super expensive. It's, about $1 a card when you end up buying it. But you take this stuff and tear it up into little bits like I've done here, because that big piece isn't even usable in the crops we're talking about. You tear that up and you go staple that into your plants in different places. Remember where you put it, because it's not going to be real visible. I think that it's been suggested that you sneak these in on your growers before they're spraying, and I don't advocate that. I would much rather get the empty greenhouse and do a spray day. Get some plants, go into a greenhouse with plants, go into a greenhouse without plants, and talk about how you're going to do a better job. That empty greenhouse video that I showed you is a real good way to see how evenly you're moving through your crop. You're going to take that hydraulic spray gun, you're going to walk where that aisle would be, and you're going to try and paint that floor evenly. I don't want big puddles in one spot and a dry spot in the other. I want to try and move in an arc and have that arc just slightly overlap as I go. And you can see that really well on a dry floor, whether it's concrete or ground cloth like we had. It allows you to see where you actually were putting the product, volume-wise. But the other technique is taking this hydrosensitive paper going into a crop, just plain water in the machine. Nobody has to suit up for this. And you go and spray it. And just like those back molars in your mouth, there's some places where you're going to have difficulty. Right up along the post line. It's going to be a hard place to spray. You got gutter connected range, you got 12 foot of bench, and then you get a post line and then 12-foot borer bench. Hitting that post line can be pretty tough because the closest you can get to it is 12 feet away. So The idea of using this hydrosensitive paper is a really good way to gauge how you're doing. So what's important is knowing how you did, going back and taking a look at what those papers look like. You want to see a nice fine speckle. If they're soaked in blue, it probably means you're hitting things a little heavy. A nice fine speckle is generally what you need to do a good job of covering and controlling pests. Go back and take those out, and then go back and see the places where you didn't do a great job. Just like those red areas where you used to have to brush again, you want to go back and spray the areas where you didn't do so good of a job and see if you can do something different. Often that means you're going to adjust angle of attack. So you might change the angle at which you approach that plant. It may mean you have to reach a little further over the bench to get there. Instead of just spraying directly from the aisle, you got a 2-foot wingspan, you'll be able to use that to help you get closer. It may mean you got to do flip-flops down the aisle. Whatever you have to do to try and improve that application, now you know how you did. And you know how you did without having bugs survive. You know how you did because you see how the plant got coated. So something like that is a really good method for helping improve the way you're doing it. So from there, we're going to move on to the ultra low volume, and I included that training bit before because that is not really applicable for this type of equipment. Here we're fogging the whole place, and that hydrosensitive paper, you're fogging with these types of machines and leaving the room closed for generally overnight. If I leave that hydrosensitive paper in a greenhouse overnight, it's going to be blue just based on humidity. So it'll look like you did a really good job, but it won't really be indicative of what happened with the fog. This is the best way to deal with this is to, pay attention to what happens to your pests. You can use the ultraviolet dyes. It tends to be a little bit messy though. So if you're going to do it, you got to kind of commit. That things are going to be a little pink for a while, or blaze orange, whichever color you choose. So when we talk about these ultra low volume machines, as I said, they are going to treat an entire space. I need a room bound by walls and a roof, and I'm going to fill that whole space. So sizing these is very important because you've got to make sure that you've got enough oomph to actually cover the space you're trying to fill. So looking at these types of machines, you have thermal foggers, which are hard to talk over. They're a little bit loud. These things are jet engines, basically. And like a jet engine, they're fast. So the idea is that we want to fill the space up quickly with a machine like this. That gives us the ability to fill the space, move on to the next space. So when you look at the way those would actually work, instead of going up and down the aisles like we looked at in the original drawing, in the other drawings, we're going to start, 2/3 of the way in, and we're going to fog to the corners, and we're going to move back, and we're going to fog to the corners, and we're going to move back, and we're going to fog to the corners from the door, and you're going to fill the place up. So there's a lot less walking involved with this. The machines, we typically, there's 5 different engine sizes of this machine. So we can size it to the right space that you're trying to treat so that you can do this. This is really the goal. We don't want you walking into the fog with this. This type of equipment is creating a droplet that's inhalable. So you want to make sure you're suited up well and you have very good PPE. But for the most part, one of the best ways to protect yourself is to stay out of the fog. Fog and paint yourself out of the room so that you're backing your way out all the time and not walking back into the fog as you go. So we always look for ways of how do you get yourself out of the space in one single direction rather than going back. And that's how we typically would coach people on how to use this equipment. Some people will want to fog up and down each aisle, but that's typically a sizing issue more than a technique issue. If you have a slightly smaller machine than you really require, you might need to fog up this aisle that way, and this way and that way, and then you're standing in it more. We'd rather have you fog at angles and have a machine that'll take from this distance and get it up here. So sizing is important, and that's we're always happy to help with that, but really that allows you to use this machine with a better technique. The other machine that was in the picture there was an automatic machine. That is an aerosol generator. It has a compressor on board, and it's got a timer. So what's really nice is the technique for this machine is you walk in the greenhouse and wheel the machine in, you put it in the greenhouse in the right spot, and you leave. It turns on and it turns off all by itself. Now, the unfortunate part of that is the technique that we have behind this is that it needs to be in the right spot, and we need to have the right amount and a proper airflow really for this to work well. All of these machines, well, the variety of machines we have in this range from very small to having onboard fans to requiring additional fans. So depending on the area you want to cover, you might need additional airflow to help move that fog around the greenhouse, but that's all basically taking place of the person in there moving the machine around. And so when you look at the pulse fog, someone's there, although it's very fast. With something like this auto fog, someone is putting the machine in the room in the proper spot, setting it up and leaving. So it completely eliminates the labor, lets you go home. So as you start to think about what type of machine you need for various jobs, you really need to think about a bunch of different things. First of those is obviously the crop. What are we actually trying to spray? Where is the pest we're trying to spray? Where is he living? What's going on with him in the, where does he like to live? How does he hide? So crop, that makes a big difference if we have a plug crop, if we have a cut flower crop, or we have a tomato crop. The target, where we're actually spraying, what we're trying to do, if I'm trying to get aphids in a rose crop, I'm spraying a different part of the crop than if I'm trying to spray mites. If I'm in a plug crop like this, I'm probably looking at some more nuisance pests, or I'm looking at disease issues. And where is that going to reside? A tomato crop is more similar to that rose crop in that I have certain guys that are going to live in certain places on that crop. I'm going to see botrytis at one place more than I'm going to see, say, mites. And so thinking about where you actually need to target is going to help you make a selection for that machine. The density of that canopy can have an impact. So for instance, something like the auto fog is a tougher machine to use in a crop like this because you have so much density of the crop. And if you're going for mites that are really down, hidden inside of that, that's a tougher machine to get that into there, whereas something like the pulse fog with a lot more force and propulsion may do a better job. Or hydraulic or targeted low volume spraying. You obviously need to be thinking about the pest and how that relates to that crop. Aphids on one crop may not be in the same place, may not be as difficult to spray as aphids on another crop. Where the botrytis is, where the mildew is, where the mites are. All of those things are things that you need to consider as far as what type of machine is going to help me do a better job. The ultra low volume ones tend to do a great job of getting things out there fairly regularly, but if you have something really, really dense, sometimes it isn't the best way to control a big problem. It's a better method to control things on a more ongoing basis. Sometimes and those tools aren't going to allow you, an ultra low volume machine is not going to allow you to be selective, whereas you may have a really bad problem in one part of the house where the aphids have all come in the vent, and you want to just go spray that, and it's fairly easy because they're all sitting up at the, on the stems and the top third of the plant. Finally, or not finally, you also need to be considering the structure that you're spraying, as far as how you're going to choose a machine. If I look at what you have here, I've got different types of structures, individual quonsets, if I got one of them or if I got 6 of them, if I've got gutter connected, or if I've got like a greenhouse that's got some open vents that are hard to close up. Sawtooth tend to have a lot of leaks. That's not going to be great for an ultra low volume machine. Something like this individual greenhouse is really nice. We get a lot of customers that love the idea of an automatic machine. and they come to us and say, I want to use an auto fog, and we'll explain to them that it's really good for a lot of applications like that, but it's an overnight application. So you'll have a grower that'll have this machine, they'll put it in this one house, and it's one night in their week that they're rotating through, maybe 5 days they're putting the machine in that one house. When I get to more houses, say I've got 10 individual houses, that auto fog is meant to sit overnight. So that means one night here, one night here, one night here, one night here, and so on, until the rotation maybe less manageable to get through that crop without more than one machine. And that's where you look at things like the thermal foggers, where you could stand in the doorway, fill the space, move to the next house, fill that space in a minute or two, go to this house, do the same thing, this house, do the same thing. You may be done with, with 6 houses, you may be done in 20 minutes. So it's a matter of, that's a greenhouse selection type situation. Gutter connected, again, same thing. How do I have to get through this crop? And then finally, logistics play into it a lot. When do you need to be back in the crop? What time do you have things happening in there? Are you harvesting certain things early in the morning? Are you to make a certain shipment system? Things that have nothing to do with the pest at all. It's things that, okay, I've got a night foreman that walks through that house. I can't fog at night. I have one house versus, this is where I was saying the structure, but one house versus a whole bunch of houses. What I do here is going to be different than what I'm going to do here. I've got impatiens and tomatoes in the same greenhouse like we talked about before. Those are all logistical things that may or may not be adjustable in your own structure, but they're affecting the application and the type of spray, type of application you're making, and the type of equipment you're using for that job. For instance, timing. I have growers that will use both the auto fog and the pulse fog in the exact same gutter connected range. The auto fog is really nice because they can park that thing in there and go home and not worry about it, and they do it once a week. The problem with the auto fog is, say in an acre range, it's going to take 2.5, 3 hours to actually complete the application. In February, that's no big deal. Greenhouse is closed. We're not venting at all. We're not worried about the solar gain in that greenhouse creating a lot of heat. We're not worried about cooling it off through venting. So we can start fogging at 6 p.m. and it's done at 9. And with a 12-hour REI starting at that point, 9 a.m. we could be back in there. We could fog a little earlier and we could get in earlier. We go to that same greenhouse in May or June, where we're worried about temperature. We have to keep the house open longer, and we're venting until 8 p.m. So, and we close the house at 8 p.m. to start fogging. We do that with the auto fog, and it takes 3 hours. It's 8 p.m., so it's 11 p.m. when the application would end. The REI would begin. If we have a 12-hour product, that means it's 11 a.m. the next morning that you can come back in. Whereas at 8 p.m., if then I break out the thermal fogger and can get done with that in 15 minutes. It's 8:15 that the application ends, the REI begins, and then we could be in there at 8:15 in the morning the next day. Simply logistics. It's a matter of how I can close my vents or things like that. Sometimes you can adjust those things, sometimes you cannot. So finally, one of the things that I mentioned we would talk about is some specialty applications and the techniques and equipment that you might want to be considering for that. Drenching is something that is fairly commonly used in the greenhouse industry. There's a number of different things that we drench, from fungicides to things like plant growth regulators to systemic insecticides. And the cost and the method of action of those tends to adjust how precious they are, how precise we need to be with them, from a way they're going to affect my crop or way they're going to affect my wallet. Both of those, precision comes down to how you use them. So commonly people are using their regular hydraulic sprayer and drenching. They're using something like an injector to go out and drench. And those applications are either going to be made where you're just splashing the stuff around. Say I'm putting on a subdued drench and I'm just trying to really soak stuff down. That's not a bad method to go in there and just water it in. When we start getting into some of the things where you need a little bit more precision, you may want to look at equipment to help. So very commonly a trigger style valve, you can turn it on and off, and you pull a trigger, 1/1000, 2/1000, like, close the valve, open 1/1000, 2/1000, close the valve. That is good for small areas. It gets a little monotonous, and sometimes it's a little bit hard to be accurate, but you can be somewhat accurate with that. There is equipment out there that will do that 1/1000, 2/1000 for you automatically. This is a machine we make called the ChemDose, and it basically puts a specific amount of liquid out on a repeated cycle. So you set both of those things, the amount of liquid along with the cycle between, and you move the line from plant to plant to get that liquid to drench into the crop. Where this really makes sense is not necessarily with fungicides, but more with things like systemic insecticides, where spilling them on the ground is expensive, or bonsai, where an extra ounce in that pot is going to have an impact. We don't want to see the plant growth different from plant to plant, so we want to put the exact same amount in each container. The other option, you have, when we look at drenching right now, another thing that's being commonly drenched is nematodes. Beneficial insects have been a very useful tool in the past, 10 years, or beneficial, not insects, beneficial products. There's insects that people are applying to go attack, parasitize pests in the crop. There's also more chemical type application means where you're either drenching something into the soil, you are spraying it onto the crop, but the same thing is true. You're using something in nature to really combat your pest. Nematodes are one of those methods where we apply them as a drench to the media, and they wiggle around and go find, whether it's a thrip larva or a fungus gnat larva or somebody we don't like, it's going to go parasitize them, alien them and eat them from the inside out and burst their way out like in a science fiction movie. But doing that, requires, again, some special tools. One of the things we developed was aeration and agitation. You're not agitating and aerating these guys, especially in a bigger tank. They suffocate. They're aerobic. They need oxygen. And so we've got this system where you can agitate your solution and then aerate it by flipping a switch to help keep those guys alive. Another important consideration with this type of application is you need to be thinking about filters, and you need to be thinking about pressures that are involved. You may not be able to use your hydraulic sprayer because the pressure is too high. You may have sophisticated or precision parts in those that you don't want to have to remove the filter from. Typically, you need to have, filters removed in these types of situations because we don't want to strain out the nematodes. We make that same system in a bucket. So this is just a prototype version, but same idea where we're just trying to agitate a solution, but it will also work to aerate a solution as well. We use onboard injection in this tank to add oxygen. And the goal is to add air. So if we're using nematodes, they're going to survive. And we want, obviously, any pesticide we're using, we want to make sure that we're not causing them to be less effective, either through pH being off in our spray tank or oxygen not being there for the nematode to actually survive the process. So the last specialty application that I want to talk about is one that we're going to cover a lot more in detail in the next webinar, but that's foaming. Foaming has been around for a long time. Foaming is something that Dramm has made foam equipment. The one on the right in that picture, we've made that for 20 years. We sell that more in the livestock industry. We sell that in the vegetable industry. We don't sell it a lot ornamentally. And I think that has to do with the fact that both both vegetable and livestock customers are dealing with human pathogens rather than just plant pathogens. But the idea of foaming is really about improving the contact time for whatever you're applying. So when we're disinfecting, that's probably the most common place that we're going to see this used in ornamentals. Just because we don't have salmonella that we have to worry about, transmitting to our customers, we do have plant pathogens that we want to prevent from damaging our crop, damaging future crop, damaging customers' crops. So something like this, cleaning up your facility well before is a really good idea. The other place where you can use foam, dependent on the type of product that you're using, is for herbicides. In both of these instances, we want to have a spray that's visible, that sticks to vertical surfaces and sticks to leaves and sticks to places where we want to really disinfect, so in cracks and crevices, and we want it to persist. And a foam is exactly that. It's going to stick and persist so that you can clean a vertical surface, say. So this video here shows the application of Zerotol in that little hand pump foamer that you saw. That little hand pump foamer looks like just a regular sprayer, but it's got the addition of a mixing valve that helps pressurize and push air into the liquid. When we add a product that will foam, so some chemistries foam on their own. Most of the quaternary ammonia-based disinfectants will foam on their own. They are pretty much a surfactant. If you are using something like in this video, Zerotol, we add a product that they make called biofoam, which helps basically expand the liquid. Zerotol won't foam on its own. And you go in and you apply, and you saw we just basically let that sit for about 5 minutes. We came back with a hose and hosed it off, and you can see the algae just kind of falls off. That's not the hose doing the job. That's not the foamer. That's the fact that the product sat there long enough to really work on that algae. And so that's there's a number of chemistries that this will work with. But the idea is that you want to be able to get that product to stick. Stick in between expanded metal benching, stick on walls, stick in different places, stick under the bench where I'm trying to hit some plants that we don't really want there, weeds. So the idea of foaming is a way to do that. And technique, obviously, with this, it's just go and spray it down. You need to have the right equipment to make it happen. We do a different version of it as well, where this is a type of machine that we've actually sold for a number of years, but you hook this up to an air compressor, and because you've got a lot more volume and pressure, it's the same idea as the hydraulic sprayer. The little pump up thing, I got to go foam, and I've got a very small target distance. With this guy and the compressor, I got a lot more force behind it. I can create more foam, and I can spray further. And so it depends on what you're trying to do. If you're just cleaning off some walls and stuff like that occasionally, it gives you the ability to do that with a small machine. But if you need to do larger areas, if your job is propagation and you're selling propagated material to customers, cleaning up is an important step in that process. So different tools to actually make that work. All right, with that, we've come to the question portion of the webinar. I think if there's any questions, they will have been sent in. If you have a question, you can still use the little question window to ask that. But right now, I'm open if there's anybody has any questions.
So we do have a question for you already. There's a grower here who produces annuals, succulents, and vegetables, and they'd like to know what you would suggest as a machine to treat all three of those.
Annuals, succulents, and vegetables. Well, as we discussed before, the crop is one of the things that you want to look at when you're selecting a piece of equipment. It's hard to make a recommendation without knowing more, though, about the structure, how you're growing them. Are you growing them on benches? Are you growing them in individual hoop houses? Are you growing them in a gutter connected range? One thing that you need to consider is the vegetables, anything edible, next to anything that isn't edible, is going to potentially limit what you can use on the products that are just ornamental. So that can be a logistical issue you can deal with by putting them in different structures or whatever. But if you can't, then you probably want to be looking for something that you can actually target the application. That doesn't mean you only have to do that. One of the things that I think is important to note when you talk about spray equipment is a lot of people tend to think that they buy one sprayer and they're done. And I like to suggest that people consider it more like tools in a toolbox. You have wrenches, you have hammers, you have screwdrivers. All of them do a different job, and you really need all of them for any basic home improvement. You may not need 52 different screwdrivers. You may not need, if you're just doing some basic stuff, you might not need a 3-inch pipe wrench. But there's, we like to suggest that people take a minimum of a couple different types of machines, because there's going to be times when they need maybe a hydraulic spray, and there's going to be times when a fog will be very useful. Even in the crop where you've got edibles and annuals, there's some products you could apply to the entire crop without having any issues. But then you might have a problem on one that you say, okay, I got to go in and hit just that crop. That could be an automatic machine, and that could be a hydraulic sprayer. Even if you use the hydraulic sprayer, if you use the automatic fogger 30% of the time, it still represents a huge savings in the amount of labor and the exposure that the grower is getting when they use that.
Great, we've got a couple more questions. Someone would like to know what you would suggest for hydroponic lettuce with gutter connects.
So very commonly that crop, well, the first thing you got to consider is you don't have a lot of things that you can apply. You have a fairly short list of pesticides that are registered. We typically are seeing, well, again, that's a place where sometimes a hydraulic spray is applicable, but a lot of times that's a very good application, a fog application. You're generally monocropped, so you're spraying the whole place. It's not like you have to, you've got different things that you're not really trying to protect. It's all fairly similar. Often, whether it's a bath hydroponic or a NFT system, the distances are difficult to do from a spray perspective. I mean, there's bath hydroponic place across the other side of the state, which has 38-foot wide baths and no aisles. So it's pretty hard to get in there from a spray with a sprayer. So a lot of times we see growers using fog equipment for that, whether it's going to be a pulse fog, the thermal fogger, or the auto fog. Now, one thing that you do need to be considering with that crop specifically is on the fungicide end of your crop, one of the probably staples you're going to be using are going to be oxidizers. So xylitol, oxidate, those types of things where it's a peroxyacetic acid-based product. And one of the things we didn't really cover in the talk, but some equipment may not be suitable for that. So something like the auto fog, the standard nozzle in that, 3 applications of xylitol and you've ruined it because it's a brass nozzle. We have a upgraded nozzle that can handle that. It's a stainless steel nozzle. So if you're looking into those type of applications, make sure that whatever equipment you're looking at can handle one of your primary pesticides, which is going to be those PAA-based products. You don't want to buy those. What you don't want to do is buy the auto fog and then find out later that you should have bought the upgraded nozzle, because buying the nozzle by itself is considerably more money than buying it when we get to keep the original nozzle and don't ship you it in the first place. So we get to save the cost of that and sell you the different nozzle. So that's the main caveat I'd put in there for any type of edible crop, because you want to make sure that your equipment can handle all the products that you're going to apply. But in that type of environment, gutter connected, you may need to consider airflow, but you probably have fans in there already. Using something like the auto fog is is a very common method right now for those types of facilities.
Okay, and I think we have time for one more question. This one's regarding applying foam as a cleaner. If you are using foam as a cleaner, do you need a foamer machine, or would you be able to use a different kind of machine for that?
So foam, there's really, well, foam is always about adding air to the liquid. There are ways of doing it without pressurizing the liquid, but the difference is, so there are some very inexpensive foam devices where they're basically a container and a siphoning injector that sucks the liquid and sucks air in using the stream of water through the device and a pressure drop at the venturi to suck the air in. The problem with those is that I think people in the industry have used them and not been real happy with them. It's probably the primary reason we developed that small little hand pump unit. Okay, so you're going to spend $30, $40 on one of those things you screw on the end of your hose, and it's going to basically make suds. And the reason it's making suds is you're using atmospheric pressure of air, and you can only get so much air into that liquid without pressure. And so it's going to make a really soppy mess. It's not going to stick to walls real well. On vertical surfaces, it might improve things a little bit, but it's not going to really get into the cracks and crevices and stick there. We made that little foamer, which is only about 130 bucks. So it's more than these little hose end things, but what we're doing is we're taking, just like we do with that bigger foamer that you saw, we're compressing air to a higher pressure so that we can put it into the liquid with more, basically creating a thicker foam. In this instance, we're using hand power. Just like if you think about the way that a compression sprayer works, all you're doing is pressurizing the tank. Here we're doing the exact same thing. We're just not filling the tank all the way. There's a level where you do not fill it past, so it leaves a reservoir of air at the top. And then we have a mixing valve in that solution line. So there's a solution line that drops to the bottom of that tank, and then up at the top where there's an intake where that tube runs into the solution for the hose, there's a mixing valve that takes the 60 psi compressed air that we've pumped up by hand and mixes it into the liquid to create a much richer foam. Because we're using 60 psi, we can get a lot more air into that foam, and then we've got ways we can adjust that. We've got different nozzles you can add to make it a thicker or a wetter foam, depending on what you're trying to do. But that, the types of equipment you're going to use then, if you're using foam regularly, now you need to look at sizing, just like you did with a hydraulic sprayer. What are you really trying to foam? But I think understanding that there's differences in the types of equipment, we just introduced that small one this year because ornamental growers were not, the bigger one that I showed you is like $1,200. It's not something you're going to jump into without having a good understanding of how foam fits in your facility. Ornamental guys have never bought into it. Livestock guys, they get it. Lettuce guys, they get it. Other vegetables, tomatoes, where human pathogens and the risk is so great, they get it. The ornamental growers haven't really adopted foam fully, and so we developed that smaller machine to make it easier for them to understand the benefits of a really good rich foam, and make it more accessible to them.
All right, well, if people want any more information or they need more best practices or they have questions, is there anywhere that they can go to get some answers to their questions?
Yeah, so as I said, there's going to be a third webinar coming up in November, which is going to talk a lot more on the disinfection, not just foaming, but fogging and things like that for disinfection. But of course, if anybody has any questions, they can email me, they can call. My phone number and email address are up on the screen right now. And Kate, as you mentioned earlier, you guys are going to have this webinar online, and you guys will be providing us a copy, so we'll have it on our website as well. So if, that won't be immediate, but in the next, couple of weeks, that will be online for you to go, and if you want to go back and see something that we talked about, you want to share that with people on your team, that'll all be available shortly.
All right, yeah, so keep an eye out. We'll be sending out an email to everyone who registered for the webinar today with that recording, and then Dramm will also have it on their website. Thanks so much for joining us, Kurt, and thank you everybody for hanging in there with us.